Good afternoon. Welcome to ILS 5 Introduction to the Nervous System. This is Lynn, and let's go ahead and get started. In this submodule, we will cover the following learning objectives: explain the general organization of the nervous system, CNS and PNS, and how the structures lead to the function of the nervous system using the following terms: receptors, afferent pathways, signaling processing, and neurological response. We will describe the cellular organization of a neuron, the cell body, axon, and dendrites. We'll define the synapse types and explain the advantages of each type. Explain how neurons communicate and transfer nervous signals through action potentials and synapses. Describe the structure and function of CNS glia cells, including astrocytes, microglia, epidermal cells, and oligodendrocytes, and compare those with peripheral neuroglia, including satellite cells, Schwann cells, and myelin sheath. Identify the peripheral nervous system pathways based on their starting location, direction, and type of signal using the following terms: visceral, somatic, sensory, and motor. All right, folks, let's get started. So here's some key terms for the nervous system. Use this to study as we get along with the slides, and make sure you know how to apply these terminology to this topic. Over here is a map that shows you the nervous system breakdown. The nervous system is the body's primary communication and control system. It regulates the body's function through the use of electrical activities. On the left-hand side, we have the central nervous system, which includes your brain and spinal cord. On the right-hand side, we have the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, that includes your motor neurons, which is neurons that bring information to the muscles and glands for responding. And then we have the sensory neurons for picking up information and sends it to the CNS. Underneath the motor neurons, we have the somatic division, which controls the voluntary aspect, the parts that you can control, and the autonomic nervous system, which are the parts you cannot control. Underneath the ANS, it's subdivided into the sympathetic division and then the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division is also known as our triple F, the fight, flight, and fright system. And then the parasympathetic is the rest and digest / SLUD. SLUD stands for salivate, lacrimate to tear up, urinate, and defecate. All right, the organization of the nervous system. The nervous system composes of these neurons, which are specialized cells, and receptors are these specialized ability to pick up a stimuli. They process this information in the brain and spinal cord to determine what response should be required, and then your brain and spinal cord begin to initiate this response to the motor output through a set of effectors. And the output is oftentimes a muscular contraction through the muscles or glandular release through an endocrine or exocrine gland. On the right-hand side, you can see how a bundle of axons are packed tightly together, very much like the organization of a muscle. On the outer compartment, we have connective tissue, and then throughout, we also have layers of blood vessels surrounding these areas. The organization of the nervous system. So the two structural divisions of the nervous system, as I've just mentioned, is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The two functional divisions of this include the sensory, on the left-hand side shown in blue, and then the motor division. The sensory division is further divided into the somatic sensory and then also the visceral sensory. The somatic sensory component detects information and stimuli that we can consciously perceive, and they include our five senses: your sight, smell, taste, hearing, and balance, as well as proprioception, which is the sensing between joints and muscles. We also have the visceral sensory, which detects stimuli that we do not consciously perceive, and they're located inside the blood vessels as well as internal organs. The motor nervous system is responsible for initiating and transmitting information to these effectors. We have the somatic, and we also have the autonomic. The somatic motor system initiates the output through the voluntary contraction of muscles, and then the autonomic controls the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, and the glandular release. So again, that's divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Here is an organization of the nerve fiber. The nerve is an organ that is cable-like with bundles of axons, connective tissue, blood vessels, and it's a component of the PNS. The nerve axons are bundled together into a region called a fascicle. You see over here these fascicles. And a fascicle contains numerous axons within it. The outer layer is called the epineuron, which is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. And then the perineurium surrounds each fascicle. This is the middle layer, also composed of dense irregular connective tissue. And then the endoneurium, which is the most inner layer that wraps around a single axon, is a layer of delicate areolar connective tissue. So you can see over here on the right-hand side that it's a big cord-like structure. A collective unit of these neuron cell bodies in the PNS is called the ganglion. You can see that there are blood vessels surrounding the ganglion. You can see numerous cell bodies scattered throughout, as well as a series of long axon tails. Nerves are classified structurally and functionally. Structurally, they can be either from the brain or from the spinal cord. Then the functional classification include the sensory, motor, or mixed. The sensory just means that it picks up information that sends to the CNS, whereas motor sends signals from the CNS to the muscles, and mixed means they can take in both information. So they can send signals to the CNS and respond by sending signals out. Characteristics of neurons. The 5 characteristics of neurons are: they are excitable, they're able to conduct signals, they can secrete chemicals, they have extreme longevity, and they are amitotic. The basic structural features of a neuron include a cell body, a dendrite, these long processes, an axon hillock, the neck region, which is responsible for communicating action potential, and a long tail called the axon. At the distal end of the axon, we have the axon terminal, which includes the axon butins, where we have the opportunity to release neurotransmitters. Here is a list of the major neuron structures. The cytoplasm within the cell body is called a perikaryon. The cell body is also referred to as a soma. The perikaryon contains certain kinds of cellular organelles. This includes this free and bound ribosomes called the chromatophilic substances, also known as Nissl bodies, for generating different kinds of proteins. It will then give rise to the cell body, which gives it a grayish color because of the type of neuron fibers they are. These dendrites tend to be these relatively short, small processes that branch off the cell body, and they can conduct rated potentials towards the cell body. So they bring in a local signal that gets converted into an action potential. The cytoskeletal component includes the microfilaments, intermediate filaments, and microtubules that form the structure, and they can also form bundles called neurofibrils. The axon is the most critical part of a neuron. It is a long, emanating process from the cell body that touches a neuron, a muscle cell, or even a gland cell. The neck region, called the axon hillock, emerges from the cell body, and it contains no chromatophilic substances at all. The cytoplasm of the axon is called the axoplasm. The outer membrane is called the axolema, and they can be split into the axon collaterals. At the very end tips, the synaptic knobs, which contain the neurotransmitter, also known as the terminal butins. In order for these neurotransmitters to be released, these synaptic vesicles have to be docked onto the terminal membrane, and that requires a calcium ion signal to begin this process. The axon's function is to conduct that action potential and eventually enable the releasing of a neurotransmitter, so that communication can take place from that cell to another neuron, a gland, or a muscle. Let's take a look at neuron transport. Axons are dependent on the nucleus and organelles to provide them with new materials to break down and use. So in order to accomplish this, these neurons have to have the ability to move stuff in directions either towards the cell body or through the axon. The term anterograde means a movement of materials in the cell body towards the synaptic knob. In other words, from the cell body down the terminal is anterograde. And then retrograde is movement of materials from the synaptic knob back towards the cell body. So from the terminal back up. There's also a series of proteins that are used to do this. These motor proteins are called kinesins that move materials forward, and dyneins that move materials backwards. So for example, nutrients, synaptic vesicles, and mitochondria compartments, these could be moved via anterograde transport going down, whereas the route of certain kinds of pathogens like tetanus toxin, herpes simplex virus causing the shingles, these can go from the retrograde from the terminal back up the cell body. Classification of neurons. Neurons are classified structurally according to the number of neuron processes that emanate from the cell body. Structural classifications of neurons include multipolar, bipolar, unipolar, and sometimes the anaxonic neurons. Multipolar neurons are the most common type, And they have many dendrites from a single axon that extends from the cell body. These ones make up the majority of all the motor neurons, as well as most interneurons. So most interneurons and most motor neurons. The second type that we have are called bipolar neurons. These have two processes that extend from the cell body, one dendrite and one axon, and these are generally found inside the special senses. So think about the eye as well as the olfaction. So olfactory for sense of smell, epithelium. The last kind, unipolar, have a single short neuron process that emerges from the cell body and branches sometimes into a T shape. These unipolar neurons are also sometimes referred to as pseudo-unipolar because they start out as bipolar, but their two processes fuse together. Most of the sensory neurons are considered in this category. So most of the sensory-based neurons fall into that category. Neurons can also be classified based on the function according to the direction of action potential, or signal, that's relative to the CNS. So based on the direction of propagation of signaling. Sensory neurons are neurons that send signals that are responsible for conducting information for both somatic and visceral receptors, and they're mostly going to be unipolar, and they lie outside the CNS. These are going to be sensory neurons. They're also referred to as afferent neurons, whereas the motor neurons are the neurons that conduct motor output to somatic and visceral effectors, and all motor neurons are considered multipolar. And the cell bodies are going to lie within the CNS gray matter. Interneurons, also known as association neurons, make about 99% of all the neurons in our body, and their job is to receive, process, and store information to decide how the body responds. And they're generally going to be multipolar. Over here is a visual showing you this kind of breakdown. On the left-hand side, we have the CNS, interneurons, cell body. The sensory neurons, afferent neurons that bring information with the afferent terminals. You can see cell body right here, and the information is brought towards the CNS. The afferent neuron is the one that relays information out to a muscle, gland, or a neuron. On the right-hand side, let's just take an example. You have a skin receptor that picks up information from the upper part of the neck, that then intersects into the ganglion root, goes into the dorsal side of the spinal cord, the back side, that's the dorsal side. And then it takes information to the interneuron, where it can then relay information towards the brain or on the same side of the body. And through the motor neuron, it exits out through the efferent ventral side to that muscle or that gland to then respond.